I think the Africa Climate Summit left Africa in a better place.
ACS and COP28 highlighted Africa's opportunities and solutions in climate action. It showcased Africa's arable land. We have a lot of land for agriculture, and it also highlighted green critical minerals and the potential for renewable energy in Africa.
So I believe that these events have definitely put us on the right track and are moving us forward in terms of impact, and it's significant.
I believe that it's also a beginning of many things to come, because there's still a need for Africa to get a bit of resourcing, and a lot of resources, not just a bit, to be able to tackle climate change.
I think the Africa Climate Summit left Africa in a better place. Why? Because there were issues that we could not really get heard on a global platform that the ACS really allowed us to focus on, especially in terms of development, the just energy transition. That's a very contentious, statement and issue, and there's a lot of conversation around it. But that's one area that I thought, got quite a bit of limelight and quite a bit of discussion space. But also, I think that we needed to see unity from African leaders in terms of the geographical, we're in the same geographical space, and our needs are more or less the same, even in terms of where we are at developmentally as a continent. And having that unified voice as we approach global discussions, I think, is very important and would allow us to have a lot more bargaining power when we approach some of the global discussions. So I think that was very important. It was a good initiative. The Africa Climate Summit was first held in Nairobi, and it was an initiative that had come up much earlier, I think in 2019 or sometime before COVID, and it was meant to happen in 2020, but unfortunately because of the issues around COVID, it didn't happen. But President Ruto later on, offered to host the Africa Climate Summit, and that's where we got to see some of the outcomes, including the Nairobi Declaration.
Those two platforms left Africa in a better place from the perspective of increasing awareness and advocacy about Africa's positive role when it comes to tackling climate change, without question. Is it enough? Not at all. I think a lot of work has to be done on the continent to begin to bring together construction ministers, for example, who are working on cities, and to see what is their particular contribution. I think the same goes for all forestry ministries. I think one could argue the same for all energy ministries. The proof of where we need to go will be when we start to see governments not only coordinating at a state-to-state level, but when ministries also begin to coordinate across different governments. And I say that because many of the challenges that come with resource management and so on are actually transnational or international in nature. So I believe that these events have definitely put us on the right track and are moving us forward in terms of impacts, and it's significant. But we do require far much more action, particularly in terms of leveraging and increasing the amounts of capital that will be available both to support public-private partnerships across the continent, but also indeed for governments themselves to be able to access more capital so they can service their developmental needs. And I also think that private banking institutions on the continent need to have a more aggressive posture in terms of understanding what is their contribution towards the finance dilemma that we find around climate. And last but not least, it's also important to say that this is what I've described is not unique only to the continent. If you go to any other country around the world, they will probably list the same sort of challenges. The reality is that the planet we're living under a sort of fossil fuel inheritance, if you will, where we have mortgaged the futures of our children. And each and every single country has to do so much more in order to reduce that mortgage. And Africa is not unique in that perspective. Some countries might have access to more capital, but you might find that they have political resilience or other sorts of factors where perhaps there's no sense of urgency in terms of dealing with these issues. From a climate perspective, we know that Africa is a particularly vulnerable continent to extreme weather patterns and ongoing climate change. We also understand that Africa has both resource blessings and resource curses, depending on how you look at it, which makes us very vulnerable to external actors at the geopolitical scale. But we're also a continent which has a growing population, in which it is critical for us to see how we can support the youth so that they have viable job opportunities in a way that gives them the sort of livelihoods that they aspire to, but without having to do so at the expense of the planet. So from that perspective, I absolutely concur that it was a positive step in the right direction, but I recognize it as one step and a number of steps that will be required for the African continent to achieve her full potential as a climate positive actor.
I think it does. I think it did. I think specifically, I think ACS was important because, I mean, we go to climate change summits, COPs in different years. We've not been able to effectively mount and present a common front. And I'm happy that that conference happened. Africa was able to say clearly and boldly what he wanted, that he needed to receive every level of support. And not just support, he needed to also be able to deal in a very fair, in a very, very secure, in a very equitable environment as much as possible. I mean, those conversations spilled over to issues around the IDA, around aid, around public debt, around also trade, illicit financial flows. So, I mean, it also shows that most of these issues are intersectional. So it was a great success in my own view. I believe that it's also a beginning of many things to come because there's still a need for Africa to get a bit of resourcing and a lot of resources, not just a bit, to be able to tackle climate change. The carbon market are still unfair to Africa. The investment flow, Africa still gets very little percentage out of that. So it's also important that conversations are held about half of Africa also has a bigger share in all of these conversations.
Yes, so the ACS and COP28 highlighted Africa's opportunities and solutions in climate action. It showcased Africa's arable land. We have a lot of land for agriculture, and it also highlighted green critical minerals and the potential for renewable energy in Africa. It promoted the value addition of green minerals and carbon sinks, and it created partnerships and pledges for new beginnings in climate action. It also focused on climate finance, adaptation, and operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund.